The security guard's hand on my chest was firm, but it was my own daughter's cold gaze that truly stopped my breath. I stood on the threshold of the Grand Horizon Yacht Club, holding a small, hand-wrapped gift, only to be barred from entering the celebration of my only child's engagement. The guard looked at my weathered, off-the-rack suit, then at his clipboard, and finally back at me with a look of polite dismissal. Before I could even speak, Chloe stepped out of the double-glass doors, her silk designer gown sweeping the marble floor, her eyes darting around frantically to see if anyone was watching. "Please, Dad, just step back into the shadow of the portico," she whispered, her voice sharp with a desperation that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You cannot be seen standing here like this. Julian's parents are inside, and they have guests from the city council. If they see you looking like a retired dock worker, it will ruin everything I have spent months building." I looked into the eyes of the girl I had raised alone since her mother passed, the girl whose college tuition I had paid by working 18-hour shifts in the bitter cold of maritime salvage yards. I searched for any flicker of the daughter who used to hold my rough hands, but I found only a stranger wearing a mask of high society ambition. I swallowed my pride, a familiar bitter taste, and took a step backward into the dimmer light of the entrance. I told myself that a father's love is unconditional, but tonight, that devotion was being weighed against the superficial vanity of a gilded cage. Chloe let out a soft sigh of relief, though she couldn't even bring herself to meet my eyes. She adjusted her diamond bracelet, a flashing token of Julian's family wealth, and told me that she had arranged a small table for me in the far corner of the secondary dining room, well away from the main pavilion. She said it was better this way, so I wouldn't feel out of place among people who spoke of real estate portfolios. What my daughter did not know, what she had never bothered to ask during her frantic climb up the social ladder, was that I knew those portfolios better than any of her new aristocratic family ever would. For 30 years, as a maritime salvage coordinator and international legal consultant, I had navigated the treacherous, high-stakes waters of salvage rights, pulling fortunes from the depths of the ocean and securing patents worth millions. I lived in my modest coastal cottage not out of poverty, but out of a desire for peace, keeping my true wealth a carefully guarded secret. To Chloe, I was just an embarrassment to her new, perfect life. Without another word, Chloe turned her back on me, walking back toward the warmth and laughter of the main ballroom. I stood alone, watching her disappear into the crowd of glittering guests. The sting of her betrayal settled deep into my chest, but it did not break me. Instead, my analytical mind, trained to spot structural weakness in massive vessels, began to observe the cracks in this perfect facade. As I walked toward the side entrance, I knew I would keep my secret, waiting to see just how high the price of my daughter's admission would truly be. To understand how my own daughter could look at me with such shame, you have to understand the steel and salt that built her existence. I did not become a ghost in her life overnight. It was a slow, agonizing erosion that began years before she ever met Julian. When my wife passed, leaving me with a 5-year-old girl and a shattered heart, I made a silent vow. I would give Chloe the world, but I would also teach her the value of an honest day's labor. In those early days, my life was defined by the relentless, freezing waters of the North Atlantic. As a maritime salvage coordinator, I spent grueling weeks at sea, managing the dangerous recovery of capsized cargo vessels. It was a brutal, high-stakes world where one wrong calculation could sink a ship or cost a man his life. I taught myself the intricate complexities of maritime law at night by the dim light of a cabin lantern, eventually securing patents for deep-sea recovery equipment that the industry still relies on today. The money began to flow in, substantial and quiet, but I never felt the need to parade it. I wanted Chloe to grow up with dirt under her fingernails and integrity in her chest, not a sense of unearned privilege. But somewhere along the way, My lessons of humility were drowned out by the seductive whisper of high society. As Chloe grew older, her ambition morphed into a toxic, social climbing snobbery. The girl who once proudly helped me clean rusty winch gears in the garage began to look at my oil-stained hands with quiet disgust. She started hiding my profession from her elite classmates, telling them I was a corporate executive who traveled, rather than the man who actually did the heavy, bone-chilling lifting on the harbor docks. My sanctuary through all of this was our modest coastal cottage. It sits on a rocky bluff overlooking the harbor, weathered by decades of salt spray and heavy winds. To Chloe, this cottage was a shameful eyesore, a drafty relic of a life she desperately wanted to escape. But to me, every creaking pine floorboard held the fading, beautiful laughter of her childhood, and the vast ocean view was a constant reminder of the depths I had conquered. Then came Julian. The first time Chloe brought him to the cottage, my instincts, honed by decades of assessing unstable cargo and deceptive legal claims, immediately went on high alert. Julian wore a perfect tailored suit that felt far too stiff for a coastal afternoon, and his wrist boasted an overly expensive watch that he made sure to check every few minutes with a tense, practiced flick. He tried to project the easy confidence of a wealthy real estate heir, but his nervous body language betrayed a desperate energy. What truly caught my attention, however, was not his superficial charm, but his peculiar interest in my home. Within 20 minutes of arriving, Julian was asking about the exact boundary lines of my coastal property and whether the deep water access rights extended past the rocky, fog-shrouded cove. He tried to play it off as casual curiosity, but a seasoned man who spends his entire life salvage hunting knows a scavenger when he sees one. There is a specific kind of coldness that only a child's fake affection can bring, and I felt it the moment Chloe set foot inside my cottage, carrying a store-bought casserole. For the first time in over a year, she and Julian had offered to visit me for dinner, but the air in my small dining room was thick with unspoken motives. Julian did not even bother to take off his designer wool coat, sitting stiffly at my wooden table as if he feared the salt-stained chair might ruin his trousers. I watched him slide a thick, leather-bound folder across the table, his movements practiced and smooth. He smiled, a hollow gesture that did not reach his eyes, and told me they were here to help me plan for my retirement. Chloe reached over, her hand resting briefly on mine, a rare gesture of physical touch that felt entirely transactional. She told me that Julian's family wanted to ensure I was taken care of, offering their high-priced legal team to assist with my estate planning. Julian chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension as he explained that by transferring the deed of my coastal cottage into a secure trust managed by his development firm, I would be relieved of future taxes. It was a slick pitch, delivered with the easy confidence of a man who assumed a retired dock worker would be blinded by legal jargon. But my mind, trained by decades of analyzing complex salvage rights, was already translating his words into their true, predatory meaning. I opened the folder, my calloused fingers tracing the crisp paper. I did not need glasses to spot the structural weaknesses in this document. Hidden beneath the dense jargon of estate preservation were clauses that stripped me of all property rights immediately upon signing, granting Julian's firm sole development authority over my coastal land. It was not a trust. It was a hostile takeover of my home, specifically targeting the deep water access rights of my rocky cove. I looked up from the paper, my gaze locking onto Julian's shifting eyes. He was desperate, acting like a captain of a sinking ship trying to salvage his own survival by robbing me. When I quietly closed the folder, the fragile illusion of family warmth instantly shattered. Chloe leaned forward, her face hardening as she demanded to know why I was hesitating to sign. I told her calmly that I would not sign away the deed to my home. Her reaction was immediate and venomous. She scoffed, a accusing me of being stubborn and selfish for holding on to a worthless piece of dirt when her social standing was on the line. She screamed that my pride was holding her back from the life she deserved, completely blind to the predatory trap her fiancé had just laid out. I remained silent, letting her anger wash over me. I told Julian directly that his contract was a fraudulent attempt to seize my assets, and that my answer was final. Chloe stood up so violently, her chair scraped against the floorboards. She hissed that I was nothing but a bitter old man, vowing to cut me out of her life forever. I sat in the quiet of my cottage, watching her storm out, knowing that the battle for my legacy had just begun. They made a fatal mistake when they assumed my silence was a sign of weakness. Julian and Chloe left my cottage thinking they had defeated a stubborn, simple old man, but they had no idea they had actually stepped into the sights of a seasoned hunter. The sting of my daughter's betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, but I did not let the grief paralyze me. Instead, I channeled that pain into the sharp, tactical focus that had kept me alive during my years in the maritime salvage industry. I walked into my locked study, sat at my heavy oak desk, and turned on the single brass lamp. It was time to stop being the grieving father and start being the investigator. My first move was to reach out to my old professional network, a web of contacts built over 30 years of prosecuting international maritime fraud. These were people who owed me their careers, from forensic accountants to port authorities. I made a few quiet phone calls, my voice calm and deliberate, asking for specific favors. Within hours, my secure inbox began filling up with encrypted PDF files. I began my deep dive into the financial skeleton of Julian's family enterprise, Vance and Sterling Holdings. I analyzed corporate registries, traced shell companies, and scrutinized their public land records and outstanding debt portfolios. My calculating mind, trained to spot structural fractures in massive vessels, immediately noticed patterns of desperate, frantic movement. The deeper I dug into the paper trail, the clearer the picture became. Vance and Sterling Holdings was not a thriving empire, it was a ghost ship, drifting aimlessly and taking on water. I discovered that Julian's family was actually on the very verge of absolute bankruptcy. They had poured hundreds of millions into a massive, failed offshore development project that had been halted by environmental regulations. Their entire corporate portfolio was on the brink of foreclosure, held together only by high-interest loans that were rapidly coming due. They were drowning in debt, and they were completely out of options. That was when the final, crucial piece of the puzzle clicked into place. They desperately needed my modest coastal land because it held the key deep-water access rights to the harbor cove. Without my land, their failed offshore project could never be connected to the shipping lanes, making it utterly worthless. My rocky, fog-shrouded cove was the only physical channel deep enough to allow heavy transport vessels to dock. If they could deceptively seize my cottage and transfer those deep water rights to their firm, they could save their entire corporate portfolio from foreclosure. My ungrateful daughter and her fiancé were trying to steal my home to wash away their own financial ruin. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock echoed loudly in the silence of my study, sounding less like a marker of time and more like a countdown to their inevitable downfall. I quietly closed the files, a cold smile touching my lips. I now possessed the irrefutable evidence of their fraud and desperation. I would let them believe they were winning, let Chloe continue her condescending whispers, and let Julian plan his grand wedding. But when the moment was right, I would pull the plug on their sinking ship and watch them drown in the very trap they had set. There is a unique, agonizing pain in holding the exact instrument of your own child's destruction, especially when she is blind to the hand guiding the blade. I sat in the dim light of my study, my eyes burning as I stared at the decrypted digital draft of the prenuptial agreement Julian's family had prepared for Chloe. It was a secret document, never meant to be seen by her, let alone by me. It had been pulled from the private server of their family attorney by a forensic accountant who owed me his life. As I read the clinical, cold legal prose, my chest tightened until it felt as though my ribs would crack under the pressure. The document was a masterpiece of corporate malice. Hidden deep within the boilerplate language of Section 9, buried under subclauses of asset division and non-disclosure agreements, was a toxic pill. It was tied directly to the transfer of my coastal property. The moment the deed to my cottage was transferred to Julian's development firm, a secondary triggered clause would activate. It stated that any assets brought into the marriage by Chloe, including the newly acquired land rights, would be legally classified as independent corporate capital of Vance and Sterling Holdings, entirely separate from marital property. Cruelly, the next paragraph outlined the terms of an automatic divorce filing initiated by Julian, citing irreconcilable differences within 90 days of the land transfer. Chloe would be cast out, with absolutely nothing. No alimony, no share of the development, and no recourse. They were never going to let her into their gilded world. To Julian and his bankrupt, desperate parents, my daughter was not a bride. She was a sacrificial lamb. They were using her social ambition, her desperate need to escape her humble roots, as a blindfold. She was the Trojan horse they were using to breach my gates, and the moment they had my deep water access rights, they were going to discard her. She would be divorced, humiliated, and penniless, while they rebuilt their empire on the ruins of her life and my legacy. A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and heavy, landing on the desk. This was the little girl I held in my arms when her mother passed, whose scraped knees I bandaged on the harbor docks. She had treated me with nothing but disdain, calling me a bitter old man, yet my heart bled for her. But as the grief washed over me, a familiar icy stillness took its place. The mourning father stepped aside, and the seasoned maritime salvage coordinator took the wheel. In my line of work, when a ship is structurally compromised, you do not panic. You analyze the leverage points. I knew I couldn't simply show her this document. If I confronted Chloe now, her arrogance and her absolute infatuation with Julian's manufactured wealth would blind her. She would accuse me of forging it, of trying to sabotage her happiness out of spite. She had built a fortress of denial, and my warnings would only make her retreat deeper into their trap. Instead of warning her, I would build a legal cage of my own. I reached for my phone and dialed my corporate attorney. I would prepare an airtight legal trap. I would let them believe they were winning, right until I pulled the plug on their sinking ship. "You are ruining my life just by standing here, Dad," Chloe hissed, her voice a poisonous whisper that cut through the clinking of crystal glasses at the grand rehearsal dinner. She looked at my simple, dark blue suit with absolute disgust, telling me I looked like a stray dog who had wandered into a palace. Julian stepped up beside her, adjusting his gold cufflinks with a smug sneer, whispering that it was time for the dock worker to go home. They wanted me gone, completely unaware that the man they were dismissing was about to dismantle their entire gilded world. I did not argue, nor did I raise my voice. I simply looked at my daughter, seeing the hollow shell she had become, and felt a final wave of pity. But the time for quiet grieving was over. The seasoned salvage coordinator took control. Instead of walking toward the exit, I took a deliberate step toward the main stage. The security guard moved to block me, but the sheer, unshakable authority in my stride made him hesitate. I picked up the microphone, the feedback ringing sharply through the ballroom, instantly silencing the chatter of 200 elite guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice calm and steady, carrying the weight of a man who had commanded rough seas. I know my presence here is a disappointment to those who value the label on a suit more than the character of the man wearing it. Julian's father stood up, demanding that someone remove me, but I pointed a calm finger toward the massive projection screens behind the stage. I told them to look up, because the entertainment was about to begin. With a single tap on my phone, the screens flickered to life, displaying the certified financial audits of Vance and Sterling Holdings. The crowd gasped as the cold numbers revealed that Julian's family empire was completely bankrupt, drowning in hundreds of millions of debt from a failed offshore development. I explained to the stunned room that they were nothing but a ghost ship taking on water, and that this entire wedding was a desperate, fraudulent scheme to stay afloat. Then I turned my gaze directly to Chloe, whose face had gone entirely pale. I told her, and the entire room, about the secret prenuptial agreement Julian's family had drafted. I explained the predatory clause in Section 9, which would trigger an automatic divorce 90 days after she signed over my coastal property, leaving her penniless once they had what they wanted. Julian lunged toward the stage, screaming for the tech crew to shut down the screens, but my legal team had already locked the system. Finally, I revealed the true crown jewel they had tried to steal. I announced that my modest coastal cottage was the sole legal anchor to a $98 million international maritime salvage claim that I fully owned. Julian's family needed my deep water access rights to save their bankrupt firm, but they had underestimated me. I looked at my trembling daughter, then at her panicked fiancé, and told them their contracts were nullified and their ship had officially sunk. I laid the microphone down and walked out, leaving them to drown in their own greed. The silence that followed the collapse of Julian's empire was not peaceful. It was the heavy, cold, suffocating quiet of a shipwreck settling onto the ocean floor. Within 48 hours, federal investigators descended upon Vance and Sterling, freezing their assets and exposing a decade of corporate fraud. The grand wedding was cancelled before the morning sun could rise. Julian and his parents fled the city, leaving behind a trail of unpaid vendors and furious creditors. Chloe was left standing entirely alone in the wreckage of her own ambition, discarded by the family she had sold her soul to impress. The country club elites who had toasted her the night before instantly blocked her phone number, treating her like a contagious disease. 3 days later, my daughter came back to the coastal cottage. The designer silk dress was gone, replaced by a rumpled coat, her eyes swollen and red from sleepless nights. When I opened the door, she did not look at me with the cold disdain of a social climber. She looked at me like the frightened child who used to run to me on the harbor docks. She threw herself into my arms, sobbing hysterically and begging for my forgiveness. She whispered that she had been incredibly foolish, that Julian had manipulated her from the start, and that she was deeply sorry. I held her close, because a father's arms do not easily forget the weight of his child, but my heart remained heavy. As she wept, her voice shifted, and she began to speak of my $98 million salvage claim. She asked if we could use just a small fraction of that fortune to clear her name, pay off the debts Julian had left in her name, and start over in a luxury penthouse. I gently stepped back, placing my rough hands on her trembling shoulders, and looked deep into her eyes. The desperation I saw there was not for my love, but for my ledger. I told her softly, but with an absolute, unshakable resolve, that I would not give her a single penny. The shock on her face was immediate. I explained to her that she had completely misunderstood the nature of real wealth. The true inheritance I had spent her entire life trying to give her was never the millions of dollars hidden in maritime patents. The real inheritance was the work ethic, the integrity, and the grit that I had forged during those freezing nights on the North Atlantic. It was the pride of earning your own way, the very virtues she had thrown away to climb a gilded cage. I told her that by bailing her out now, I would only be financing her delusion. ensuring she never learned how to stand on her own feet. She had to feel the gravity she had defied. She would have to find an honest job, rent a modest apartment, and rebuild her life from the very bottom, just as I had done so many years ago. She cried out, accusing me of being cruel, but I simply kissed her forehead, told her that I loved her, and gently closed the door. Walking back to my quiet kitchen, I looked out over the vast ocean. My dignity was intact, my secret legacy was secure. And as the quiet settled over my modest cottage, I knew I'd finally given my daughter the only lesson that could ever truly save her.